Welcome to our class lecture on Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham Jail. If you haven't read the full essay yet, please do. But today we're going to be talking about a couple of things. First, we're going to give a little bit of context of what King was doing and what was going on at the moment he wrote his letter. We're going to talk about what provoked the letter, specifically who provoked the letter. And then we're going to do some close reading of a couple of select passages to help introduce us to rhetorical analysis, which is going to be fundamental for us for the remainder of the semester. Some things to note before we go into some close reading of passages is first, when King wrote Letter from Birmingham Jail, it was shortly after a protest of about 53 people led by King ended in all of the attendees being arrested. And this was in Birmingham, pushing back against segregation laws that were present at the time. King gets put in Birmingham Jail, and he loses access to his constitutional rights in terms of right to a lawyer, a right to attorney, and also a right to contact his family. And so he's in Birmingham Jail in solitary confinement and writes this letter. The other thing that is important to remember is it's directed not just to people in general, but to a very specific audience. And you can see it right at the beginning of the letter, dear, and then who he's addressing it to. And the names you see listed there are 6 clergymen in Alabama who had written a letter resisting and dismissing the protests that were happening in Birmingham. So I want to take a look at that first, and then we will move on to King's letter. You're welcome to read the entire letter. It's actually located in your textbook right before where you see Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham Jail essay. But I pulled some passages that I want to draw our attention to and to talk about a little bit. One of these says, and this is from the clergyman, "We commend the community as a whole, and the local news media and law enforcement officials in particular, on the calm manner in which these demonstrations have been handled. We urge the public to continue to show restraint should the demonstration continue, and law enforcement officials to remain calm and continue to protect our city from violence." If you are familiar with images from the civil rights era, we can see these words like calm and gratitude towards the media and law enforcement. We might be able to see that there could be questionable, specifically when we think about images of hosings and dogs being unleashed on Black Americans protesting for the right to vote, for the right to get rid of segregation, all of these different things that were happening. And so if you read this passage and kind of really aggressively raise an eyebrow, that shouldn't be surprising, because this isn't necessarily what the law enforcement and the news media were reflecting. It wasn't calm. And so when remain calm appears, or on the calm manner, we can sort of see who these clergymen favor and what type of response to activism they favor. They follow this passage too by saying that they urge Black people in Birmingham to withdraw from the demonstrations and unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. So no more protests. They prefer peace, and somehow that's going to create a new desegregated Birmingham. This is sort of the optimism of the clergyman that as I'm talking, you might be reflecting on your reading of Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he sort of directly says, no, this doesn't make sense, and here's why. The 6 clergymen carry on, "When rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders, and not in the streets." And then they appeal to the people protesting to observe the principles of law and order and common sense. So we can see right here the clergymen prefer law and order, handle things in the courts, not in the streets. They have a very specific mentality of what good protest will look like in Birmingham. We know very well this is not the mentality King had, and we can see a very specific response in his letter from Birmingham Jail to these very specific clergymen. And I want us to keep this in mind as we talk about Letter from Birmingham Jail, because this is what rhetoric is made up of. When we watched the What is Rhetoric and read the What is Rhetoric notes from this week, we can see that King, writing Letter from Birmingham Jail, has a specific audience, understands that audience, and is directly appealing to them through logos, pathos, ethos, all of these different elements. So understanding who he's speaking to, even if we don't agree with what they're speaking to, helps us understand King's essay even more. Who is he specifically talking to? What do those people think? And how is he using rhetoric to persuade them to think differently? Some other key themes from the letter that was written by the clergyman that King was responding to. You see a lot in both pieces of writing references to this idea of an outsider. King explains how he feels about this term, and he's specifically talking about the first underlined part here, where they were criticizing the demonstrations directed and led in part by outsiders. And so, this idea of an outsider, somebody from Atlanta, which King was from, coming into Birmingham and creating protest, was problematic for the clergymen. They thought that things should be settled locally, not from people all over the country coming in and dictating the way the local life was. King makes a very good argument about why he disagrees with that sentiment. And so, we can stress that theme of an outsider when we read Letter from Birmingham Jail and have a better sense of what he's talking about. They carry on with the same idea in that second paragraph. I underlined the line, issues can be best accomplished by citizens of our own metropolitan area. And so we can see the resistance that these clergymen were having towards protesters and civil rights leaders like King. And so first, right when we move into King's letter from Birmingham Jail, I want to dwell on these first couple lines and paragraphs. Before we even get to the body of the texts, we see, my dear fellow clergymen. And he's writing those 6 clergymen who we were just talking about, but he very carefully inserts the word fellow here. And this is important. If you're trying to use rhetoric to persuade, King here, it understands that by saying fellow clergymen, he's already sort of casting a fishing line out and reeling them in a little bit. He's putting himself on the same playing field, and this will almost warm his audience up to his message. He knows that he's going to be disagreeing with the clergymen here and trying to persuade them. And so by starting off right away with fellow clergymen, the intention of that sort of rhetorical move that King makes is to maybe take down the clergyman's walls a little bit, and hopefully they'll listen to him better because of a move like that. It's establishing his ethos as a person because he's also a clergyman. They have the same values, or supposedly should have the same values. And so King is playing on that concept here. He does something very similar if you look to the bolded text at the end of the first paragraph. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statements in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. And so here he's appealing to the clergymen once more, trying to appeal to their ethos and their morals. He's saying, I know you don't mean to be doing what you're doing. Whether or not that's true is a whole other sort of conversation. But he's trying to be persuasive. He's trying to be careful with his words, and say, look, I think you're of goodwill, so listen to me. Let me pull you in and let you understand why, despite your good intentions, what you're saying isn't maybe translating the way you intend it to, why your actions in that first letter might be problematic. We have another bolded part here, that I want to talk about. I think I should indicate why I'm here in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the view which argues against, quote, outsiders coming in. So he's directly quoting the passage that we read previously, where they didn't like this idea of an outsider, and they meant King specifically when they said outsider. And so here he's going to attack that concept head on and explain to them why that's not the case. He goes on to talk about that he is the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a very, very important civil rights organization. They're housed in Atlanta. They have, he says, 85 affiliate organizations across the South, one of them being in Alabama. And he's talking about all of these different things that, like, yeah, no, I'm supposed to be in Alabama. I might be from somewhere else, but my message belongs here, and me being here is justified. So he's trying to sort of quell or silence this idea that he's an outsider, that he doesn't belong there. And then so the last sentence that I have bolded, so I, along with several members of my staff, am here because I was invited here. I am here because I have organizational ties here. So this is where he starts to chip away at that outsider idea. And he's using logos to do it, right? This is all verifiable, logical information that will hopefully help build his persuasive message and persuade his audience. If we look here too, just to that very last paragraph on the bottom, this is that same introduction with the paragraph added on the bottom. Let's read that together and think about this in terms of rhetoric. But more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their thus save the Lord far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns. And just as the Apostle Paul left the village of Taurus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. You might have noticed when you read the entirety of Letter from Birmingham Jail, religion is very important here for obvious reasons. King was a reverend. He's writing clergymen in Alabama, so they have this shared experience of religiosity and church experience and respect for religion. And he's doing work here to build on what he already established in that my fellow clergyman statement at the very beginning. He's trying to create an ethos between him and his reader to appeal to their morals, to appeal to their virtues, and change their minds with how they think about the protest. And so, if we're reading this passage, specifically this last paragraph, we start to get a sense of the audience. Who is the letter addressed to? How is he talking to these folks? We can get a sense of the subject of the essay about demonstrations and civil rights for Birmingham and how that should play out specific to the civil rights era. We get a sense of King's purpose to explain to the clergymen that even though the protests might take the shape the clergymen approve of, they are necessary. And we get to peek into the rhetorical strategies he's going to use, one of which is appeal to religion. He does other things here, but this appeal to religion is consistent throughout. And it's just one example. He does, again, many other things throughout the essay. And so in this list on the side, this 1, 2, 3, 4 of things that we're starting to notice if we analyze the passage for rhetoric, we're starting to see that sack pets that you saw in the what is rhetoric, the subject, audience, purpose, context, etc., that we talked about when we were discussing rhetoric. And so we can start to see how you find those elements in an essay based on what we just read. Rhetorical analysis, though, is always going to ask us to dig a little bit deeper and understand, okay, how does the rhetoric work here? What makes it so effective? And so I've noted some things. We're still talking about that same paragraph that was at the end of the last slide. If you recall from the What is Rhetoric lesson, ethos is the appeal to morals and ethics. When someone is appealing to ethos, they are either establishing their own ethos or morals so that you trust them, or they're trying to appeal to you, their audience ethos and morals. If you think about when a company makes a commercial and puts it on TV that tells you that they donated to an organization that you support as well, they're trying to establish their ethos. If you, in the same vein, see a commercial that's trying to convince you to recycle and shows, for example, marine life struggling through garbage that's in the ocean, they're sort of appealing to your ethos and a little bit of your pathos to persuade you and get you to believe in their message. So that's kind of what we're talking about here initially. One example of King using ethos is when he makes note of his title as president, which we've kind of briefly mentioned. Additionally, King is appealing to ethos and his audience when he frames his argument on the moral truth of a higher power. In a sense, he's speaking to religious leaders and establishing himself as part of their community, which we talked about in the beginning. And I want to look closely at that part where he talks about Apostle Paul. You don't have to know a lot about religion to sort of recognize some of these names. Specifically, King's using a metaphor here, which if you've never heard the word metaphor before, it's when someone uses like or as to make a comparison between two things. So if someone says that person runs like a horse, they're using the metaphor of a horse to talk about and explain how quickly somebody is running. We do it all the time. And so King is doing it here just as Apostle Paul. He's comparing himself to Apostle Paul, which is a figure that the audience that he's speaking to, specifically the clergyman, knows, understands, and respects. And so he's bringing himself to a similar level of respect for his audience. Just as Apostle Paul left the village of Taurus, he left Atlanta to come to Birmingham. So we can kind of see the comparison he's making. So am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. So we have another metaphor happening there. Like Paul, I have to do this. It's very important. And his audience would be familiar with the biblical story that he's talking about. If we move on a bit from the first page or so of the text, a few pages later, there's a very long excerpt of when King is trying to use pathos to persuade his audience. He's not talking about religion here, but instead about a really personal experience that he had with his daughter. This isn't something that the white clergyman would be able to understand. But he understands that these clergymen hold themselves to this idea of family values. And so he talks about family here in a way that appeals to the emotions of his audience. I'll read this part of this passage and then we'll go from there. When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see that her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? And it goes on for quite some time, but we can even see here a really dense, important, powerful use of rhetoric. First, the writing here reads differently than the rest of the text. He's almost poetic here with the language he's choosing, but it's devastating and it's supposed to appeal to the pathos, to the emotional sort of center of the people reading it. He goes into vivid description of Black experience. He is using details to illustrate for his reader an example of what the current laws are doing to Black people, specifically to Black children. When he talks about the ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in the little girl's mental sky, the way she sees the world is becoming clouded, and this imagery is supposed to sort of consume the reader. And even if they've never had that conversation with a daughter or experienced that type of moment, it's supposed to help them understand the impact and make it feel real for the reader. And so we have pathos happening here because it's trying to evoke sympathy through the words that he's using. For example, King knows that the clergyman claims support families. He mentions children here because he knows that the clergyman will read this and feel upset that the children are enduring this suffering, or that's at least what he hopes to do through this rhetorical appeal. You might also remember from the What is Rhetoric lesson that sometimes the way we write, the composition choices we make, affects rhetoric. If you read the entire excerpt from the text, I've only pulled a few lines, you'll notice there isn't very much punctuation and there's especially not a lot of periods. And you might know when we put a period in a sentence, not only is it grammatical that after a complete sentence we're going to put a period in, it gives your reader a sort of mental break, a pause, before we move on to the next sentence. If you look at the full page of text where this passage comes from, it's a very long paragraph, one of the longest in the essay, and it has nearly 0 to maybe 1 or 2 periods in the entire paragraph. When I read this, I sort of start to feel kind of like a repetitive hammer hitting a nail and driving a point home, and you don't have a chance to come up for air because this story is supposed to sort of take over your emotions, and you can't look away because there's no period, no time for the sentence to end to look away. And so this is a moment where composition is really doing some work and doing some labor in order to persuade us and to make us feel what the writer is trying to make us feel. In this passage to the right of the screen, we're going to talk about the way he uses logos. Specifically here, I think it's a really great example because he's just giving definitions and explaining those definitions. He's not really appealing to emotion here where he's making people feel sad or using language to make people feel sad. He's not appealing to morals necessarily. He's using textbook definitions of what it means to be just, what it means to be unjust, what laws are just, what laws are unjust. For example, he says an unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey but does not make binding on itself. This difference is made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. And then he goes into another example as well. And so what we're seeing here is just sort of strict, clean definitions that are appealing to the logic of the audience, that he's expecting the audience to understand, and it will sort of process in their brain and work as persuasion because of the core logic that it holds. If a reader was not persuaded by the poetic writing or the metaphors or by the ethos that he established with religion and invoking religion, hopefully they'd be persuaded by this third rhetorical push of logos to maybe solidify the message that he's putting forward. And so this is another really great example of a time where King is using rhetoric. These three examples I've pulled of pathos, logos, and ethos are not exhaustive. This text is full. I think if you go and skim through after us talking just about these few areas, you'll see like, wow, it is inundated. There is tons of rhetoric here. So hopefully this will help us find these things on our own as we go to write our papers that are rhetorical analyses papers of this essay. Just to wrap up, we've covered only a few of these rhetorical moments in King's famous essay, Letter from Birmingham Jail. As we're moving on to our rhetorical analysis paper, we're going to create a formal essay that analyzes this essay for rhetorical strategies. You're not going to be able to cover all of them. So what I advise is to pick a couple of moments, maybe one paragraph for logos, where you really zoom in and spend some time talking about times that he uses ethos, and then one paragraph for pathos, or one paragraph for logos, and then you would write an introduction that brings all of those components together. Or let's say you want to write just about the times where he's talking about religion and using religion to persuade. You can compose a whole paper about that. You can compose a whole paper about when he talks about family, or you might have noticed something different altogether. Maybe you want to write about the times where he talks about this outsider idea and analyze the rhetoric. What you're not going to do, and sort of what we didn't do here, is comment on the historical, maybe opinions of the period. We're strictly analyzing for rhetoric. It can be very tempting, specifically in the moment we are right now, where an essay like this is so relevant, despite being written more than 40 years ago. But we're trying to really stay focused on the goals of this assignment, which is to analyze for rhetoric. And so you want to skim through the essay. Pick a few times where King is using rhetoric that you find interesting and start to create an essay focusing on these strategies. And again, remember, your goal is only to analyze the rhetoric, which is what we did here. And I think, as you can see, the notes that we have and the things we've talked about today should model for us the type of thinking that I want us to be doing. And so hopefully you can put post-it notes or highlight important lines or take really good notes while you're reading of things you're like, wow, this writing is really cool. It's really effective. What rhetoric is here and how does it work?